Hello, everybody. I think most of you were my students, but I'm Charlotte Bunch. And the ones who weren't my students were Mary Hartman's students, because I inherited the open introductory seminar from Mary. So everybody in this room was influenced either by Mary or me or both. So we take a lot of pride in seeing you all here and having you come back. Today's program, we want to really look at the ongoing project of transformation, or you might just say making a life, making a good life, a life worth living. And some of the scholars from different years are going to speak to us in the beginning about some of what they've learned moving from this program into the real world, as they call it, in various jobs and different situations. And then we want everybody in the room to participate. So I'm going to start by asking them some questions, but then open it to you. As many of you know, I like to ask questions as a way of teaching and finding out what you already know and building from there. So today we want to look at this 20th anniversary as a time to reflect and to also celebrate what's happened and what the program has meant for you individually, but also for this community of friendship that you built. And I love the slogan. I want to take home several red bags that say community changes everything, because I think that's really true. And I hope that that's been your experience of being in the IWL. So with that, we're going to start by having each of the panelists come up here. You know, I like people to speak up and to stand up. So I've asked them all to come to the podium for their first response to the first question, and then we'll speak to you from the table as a panel, and then we'll open it to you. So we're going to go in the order of the years when they were IWL students. So our first speaker will be Lilian Cardona. Lilian is an attorney with the prior financial services experience and is currently the special counsel at the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the government agency responsible for regulating the U.S. futures options and swaps markets. And she'll be setting up private consultation behind the doors later. So if you give her the right food or whatever, right? And the first question that I'm asking all of them to speak to, and I think I'll introduce you as you come up so that people don't forget who's who. The first question we want you to talk about is, what has stimulated you most about the work you do now? And what were the experiences that you had in the IWL as well as elsewhere, though we know that most of your best experiences were here. What are the experiences that you think best prepared you? And what surprised you? What were you not prepared for that you might want to share with some of the current students? And from your point of view, how has this influenced how and the way in which you see yourself in the world today? So we'll start with Lilian.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Hi, everyone. Just want to thank the IWL and Mary Hartman, Mary Trey, and Lisa Hetfield, and Sasha for inviting me to be part of this really, really important day. I mean, 20 years is a fantastic milestone. So when I think about sort of what motivates me, it sounds a little geeky to say, but I have an interest in data and financial markets. Even though I studied political science and did Eagleton and IWL, I knew that I wanted to be an attorney, and I've always been very lucky to have good mentors along the way. And advice that I got as a student here at Douglas was to take some time between college and law school to really make a decision on whether or not that's what I wanted to pursue. And so I did that. And in that in-between time, I ended up working on Wall Street and just happened to really love it. I liked it. And when I graduated in 2007, so as you might know, in 2008, It was not a great time in Wall Street. I actually worked at Lehman Brothers, and so very tumultuous time. But I knew that I was interested in government regulation, legislation, and pursued law school after 3 years working in finance. And I started working at a big law firm after law school in DC, working on derivatives regulation, because post-financial crisis in 2010, a very big overhaul of the over-the-counter derivatives market happened. And so it was sort of the perfect time to become a derivatives lawyer, because everybody was learning it at the same time. And I just happened to have sort of an insider's knowledge of like what happens when things go bad, because I had been on the floor when things went bad. And so that really put me in a position to understand a pretty complex area of the law from a practical perspective. And so I think a lot of the tools that I learned from IWL were to just be prepared and have a lot of confidence. Although that in itself has been, for myself, a big transformation project. It's not like I walked out of here with, I thought I had a lot of confidence, and then I went to the real world and felt very small. And in law school, and particularly in the big law firm, I felt very lonely. I think that was what was very surprising. The practice of law can be very, very lonely. Yeah, so I can speak to that a little bit more, but that's sort of, but my biggest message, I guess, from those experiences in the last decade has been things are not black and white. There's a lot of gray, people sort of speak, if you don't go to this law school, you can't work at a big law firm. If you don't do this, that's not true. I'm like an example that a lot of black and white things are not true. You sort of have to have your goals and work on your confidence, and being prepared and seeking out opportunities can help you navigate really difficult times personally, even in career-wise, when your company ends up being the biggest bankruptcy in U.S. history. So those are some initial thoughts.
Thank you, Lilian, and I guess that is a pretty good survival story. I forgot to tell you that her dog is named Eleanor Roosevelt. Yeah. So, that seems like a pretty good start right there, and she lives in Virginia. Our next speaker will be Vanity Jenkins from the class of 2010, and Vanity is the Senior Managing Director of a culturally relevant design for Teaching Trust, an organization that works to develop school leadership teams, principals, and executive directors in Dallas, Texas. So she came a long way to be with us, and she's also has a lifelong commitment to equity for children in underserved communities. So Vanity, please.
Hi, everybody. I want to start by reiterating what's already been said tonight. This is such a monumental night, and I'm just happy to be here to celebrate the IWL and celebrate some of my formidable experiences that helped shape who I am and how I lead in my current work and current organization. The thing that I think helped prepare me the most at Rutgers was studying women's and gender studies and Africana studies. So I studied myself, and that really helps me get a firm foundation on who I wanted to be and how I wanted to lead. The other thing in particular from the IWL that really helped shape how I lead is it was my first experience having a true ally in friendship. Another scholar who's not here today, but her name was Danielle Levine, and she was a white woman who really modeled for me what allyship looked like before I even had the terminology. And I think one of the downsides to that was when I started my career, I realized that not everybody was like Danielle, and I was not surrounded, especially in education. The majority of teachers are white women, and I was not surrounded by people like Danielle. And so I had to learn how to navigate that. and the work that I started to do because of that is centered on racial equity. So in my former role, I was working for Teach for America, and I led 5 teams there, and so I was able to really decide what our programming was going to be. Teach for America is another organization that is predominantly white, and so I was able to ensure that those teachers had the foundation that they needed to before they went into classrooms with predominantly black students. And I was able to create and design a curriculum focused on racial equity, understanding indigenous history and indigenous rights, understanding what it means to wake up every day on stolen land that we do not own in South Carolina, and understanding what it meant to be in a state where the state was built on the backs of black people in that country, and so how those things were still happening in South Carolina, what the implications of that were, and what teachers needed to do in order to make sure that students had that understanding so that they could then be the ones who are going to create change. We are not, well, my generation, you all are still much younger than me, a lot of you in here, but we're not going to be the ones who actually create the change, and so how can we support students to understand the complicated history that we have so that they can start to formulate ideas, new opinions, new approaches, and design new systems that are going to be more equitable. The systems that we have were designed to create inequity, and so how can we give students the knowledge that's going to help them to not only tear down those systems, but build up something that is going to be more equitable. And so I really think about what I learned about women's leadership while I was in the IWL, and how I can continue to create that in spaces that are still predominantly male-led. So schools predominantly led by men, their supervisors predominantly men, even though teachers, the people who are in the schools, are usually mostly women. And so how can I bring women's leadership to the center, as we heard about in the video, and make sure that people understand, one, that women do lead different, and those differences I think are starting to be acknowledged more. There's a lot of talk around emotional resilience and how important that is in the workplace, and really that is how a lot of women typically lead. And so how can we bring those things to the center? How can we focus our work and really listen to women of color, and understand that if you follow what's happening with women of color, that's usually what's happening to everybody. And so how can we create more equitable spaces for children and for the people that are working with children in schools?
Thank you, Vanity, and I think we better have you teaching all the teachers everywhere we can, because I think that's certainly an important insight. Our third speaker is Candace Arab Lee, who's from the class of 2011. And Candace is a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in the treatment of gender and sexual minorities. She's also an expert on issues of women with eating disorders and has facilitated psychotherapy groups for women with eating disorders for the last 7 years. And she holds her doctorate in clinical psychology and human sexuality studies. So Candace.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. I currently serve the AIDS care group, one of the longest living HIV clinics in the Philadelphia area, as their director of psychology services. The AIDS care group is an organization I am tremendously proud to be associated with. It was founded by professionals exiled from their respective professional communities for advocating for people that were untouchable in that moment in history. The organization was founded in the late 80s in Philadelphia, where the HIV epidemic was out of control, and there was not enough people doing the work that was being done at our agency, and people were dying as a result. So to borrow from that tremendous history and to energize the work that I do in response to that history has been a tremendous gift in my professional life. It is my professional home, and a place where I feel I can really professionalize so much of what I have to offer. there's something really exciting about the history of the grassroots efforts that made our clinic a major player in healthcare in the Philadelphia area for HIV positive people. There's a way I think about my work as professionalizing a call to action that I've had since as early as I can remember, in the same way that the founders of my organization do. I think in terms of what helped prepare me for the work that I do now, I did some very meaningful introspective work in college and graduate school, and accepting and owning my own privilege, not apologizing for it or denying it, but investing in allyship and in promoting social equity. I've seen too many well-intentioned therapists apologize for their privilege or denounce it by suggesting that they're more like their patients than not. I think there's something respectable to the patients I see, largely impoverished with multiple disability statuses, gender and sexual minorities of color, in owning and accepting privilege and being honest and sincerely curious about others' experiences without pretending you know things about others' plights that you couldn't possibly understand fully, without really entering their emotional and social worlds. There's a way that I think about one element of what I have to offer in relationship to my patients as modeling being okay with my truth. And particularly when that truth is different from others, and celebrating meaningful, authentic connection with someone from a very different corner of the world. I think in terms of what I'm surprised most by in the work that I do is the level of competition I see in my line of work. I continue to be surprised by this. I'm surprised at the level of ego investment in the work sometimes, and how easily professional ego can interfere with centering patient needs. I sometimes become really surprised at how difficult it can be to hold empathy for the most disenfranchised among us. I'm surprised at how much of my job is modeling and encouraging empathy in staff. I sometimes become quite resentful of it, frankly. That so much of my energy goes to helping staff manage their own reactivity. But I think that in a leadership role, particularly in a supervisory role, it's the kind of investment that carries tremendous staying power. That makes me a little more okay with borrowing time from my clinical work to really taking on this role of modeling sincere empathy and curiosity and centering patient suffering and patient needs. I think it's the kind of work that has longevity. It's definitely not fruitless, though sometimes it feels that way. It's a meaningful contribution to the kind of environment I and my patients can really thrive in. And so that perspective helps me tolerate it and assuage myself of my resentment. Thank you.
Thank you, Candace. And I think this question of modeling empathy in a society that doesn't seem to have enough of it and is very competitive is a really important question in our moment in time right now. So we may come back to that and get some other reflections. Our fourth speaker is Hannah Hamdi. Hannah is from the class of 2014 and was actually my student. The others were Mary's students, so now I get to have one of the students from my seminar. Hannah is currently an adjunct professor in public health at York College in the CUNY, City University of New York system, and she has a minor in women's and gender studies and a master's in public health from Columbia University. And she has worked on many projects in looking at child-friendly health issues, child-friendly spaces for Syrian refugees living in Jordan, palliative care in hospitals in Senegal, surveillance of childhood asthma in New York City, etc. So she's taken the local is global and the global is local to heart in her work, and she will speak to us now about her work as an epidemiologist with public health. Anna.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for all the work that you do here at the Institute for Women's Leadership and in the world. Wow. Okay. So I think what stimulates me about the work that I do is that I try to focus on grassroots problem solving. So I studied here at Rutgers in the School of Engineering, and I really like solving problems. And public health, I think, solves the kind of problems that I'm interested in. And it looks at health issues contextualized within communities and within their history and within their different identities. And so, so I think that as a data analyst, because that's what epidemiologists are, they analyze health data, I don't like to look at numbers independently. Numbers reflect the realities of our communities, and they reflect our context, and they reflect our lived experiences. And if we don't think about these things when we're looking at them, and we don't talk to people, if we don't learn deeply about the work that we're doing, then we're not really creating this very comprehensive evidence that can lead to better policy change, that can lead to better programming, that can lead to us having a better world. And I think that the hope that my work does that is what really energizes me about it. I think what surprises me most are people that I work with. I think people will always surprise me. And maybe in that people are similar a lot of the places that you go, or maybe in that they like somebody will always have maybe a better idea than you. And I think that's, or can help you build off of an idea, right? And I think it's important that we talk to people about things that we know and learn from people about things that they know. I had a colleague in Uganda who was telling me about his plan for Kampala, which is the capital city in Uganda, and he's like, yeah, I want us to have like a public transit system, and I want us to be able to have like a train line and like better infrastructure and all these things. And he had like such a vision for his own country, and I'm like, wow, what vision do I have for America or for the places that I hold identity from? And I think people often give me hope. And so like with the recent midterm elections where we have congresswomen who have minority identities and who are women, who are really championing causes that we all have thought about and that we all care about, I think is really inspirational. And I think speaks to also this idea of hope, and that we can hope for and work toward something bigger than ourselves. Thank you.
And the question that we'd like each of you to speak to this time is what, from your vantage point in the jobs that you're now doing, what does women's leadership look like to you now in 2019? We talked about women's leadership in our courses over the past 20 years, each of you, but now that you're out there engaging in it, what would you say to someone who asks you about what is women's leadership now? And in particular, are there connections from the leadership lessons you learned in the class or while you were doing this work that you would like to share with people who are here in the room? Okay, so we'll look more at leadership directly. So we'll go in the same order. Okay,
Great.
and then you have a mic down there.
Okay. So, I think from my vantage point as sort of being like the corporate person here, you know, like I mentioned, I think the practice of law as a woman was a bit lonely because unlike at IWL and at Douglas, where I had access to so many mentors, and I think when I got to the firm, in the 6 years that I practiced law, I only had one female partner that I worked with directly for a short time, and she made a huge impact on me. And I think in the time that I was there, when I thought about my own leadership, whenever there were young associates, new associates who came on, I went and introduced myself, and I said, I found this place, you know, in my brain I was like, this place was so lonely and it was awful because I didn't feel like I could go talk to anyone. So I made myself available to talk to, not even just women, but the young male associates who would come on the groups. I knew what was about to happen to them, and they didn't. And so I really tried to build a community, and I pride myself. I just left the firm a month ago, and at my going away, it was one of the fairly well-attended ones, not because I'm like Miss Popular, but because I was a friend to people, right? People value when you make yourself available, particularly in the practice of law, when the billable hour has a really big impact on culture. People sort of see the time, you're like, well, this is not billable. Me talking to you is not billable. But taking the leadership to know that it's more about billing, right? It's about building a community, making the culture at the firm. So some of the things that I really didn't like, it's sort of across big law firms. Attorneys tend to have this sort of different culture from themselves and the staff. So like staff are treated differently, or like lawyers sometimes don't even say hello to the staff. And I've worked at 2 different law firms, and I've spoken to several people, and they sort of agree like, yeah, this is a thing that happens. And so I always made a point whenever new associates came on, and I said, if you're gonna sit an associate row where I'm the senior associate, we don't treat staff like that. We say good morning. We invite people to staff. Of course, staff comes to lunch with us. So sort of being like, yeah, of course, this is what we do. Just approaching it from a much different perspective. So mentoring people, being an open door policy, treating people, regardless of their formal education or their status, like people. It's very important within corporate spaces, I have found. And within, even though I am not I guess now I'm in the government, but most of my experience really has been in corporate, I've tried to build public-private partnerships. So while I've been at the firm, I've, volunteered to lead the Generous Associates campaign to raise funds for the Legal Aid Society. And in DC, this is a huge campaign. I mean, it raises about 40% of the Legal Aid Society's overall budget. So just seeking ways to build the public and private relationships and partnerships is really important. Oh, and sorry, last thing. So the lessons that I really take on, and when I seek out women lawyer groups in DC, I kind of laugh a little inside, because recently I had a conversation with a pretty badass woman partner, and she was sort of giving advice to the younger associates, and she was like, have you ever heard anyone talk to you about having a board of directors? And in my mind, I'm like, I heard about that 12 years ago at the IWL. And so a lot of women do not have the benefits, and they're not as fortunate and lucky as we are to have sort of learned about these things in college. So I was like, yeah, I heard about that before. And mapping out your network. That was an exercise that I remember we did at the IWL. Mapping out your network and sort of seeing it, and I sort of try to do that from time to time to visualize who's in your network and how can you connect people, and I have found that to be really valuable at the law firm, to help people find other people to talk to about their experiences and get them through the first years at a law firm that are a little bit harder. So those have been really good lessons.
So like I shared earlier, in education, women, there's a lot of women. There's women everywhere, mostly teachers. And so I think one of the way that I would describe women's leadership in education right now is that there needs to be more of a sense of collective leadership. I think when I left the IWL, I still left thinking that I was going to be the leader that made the change and did the thing. And I wasn't thinking as much about what could we collectively do in a space, at a school, in a community, etc. And so that's where I really try to spend my energy now. Similar to what you were sharing, power mapping is something that I started doing at my school, and figuring out who actually, the principal might be the one who is the final decision maker, but who is actually influencing that principal, and how can I have conversations with that person? Is it a parent that holds the most influence? Is it another teacher? And how can I build a relationship with that person so that I'm able to make whatever change that I see fit at the school, or that I think is going to benefit students? And once I was able to do that in my second year of teaching, I was able to see school-wide change implemented at a much faster rate, instead of in my first year, I was I was very young and naive in a lot of ways. And so I was doing a lot of blaming things on the principal or blaming things on the students, whoever was convenient at the time, instead of really understanding and looking at myself and figuring out what gaps I had, what wasn't I doing, and what did I need to change in order to be better. And so I remember in my first year, over the summer, having a really deep moment where I realized that if my principal actually wanted to harm children, there's lots of ways to do that and make more money, right? You're not going to go into education if that's what you want to do. There are lots of ways that you could do that. And part of the reason I had to have that reflection is there's still corporal punishment in Mississippi. And so just seeing that on a daily basis made me question, lots of things about my principal. And so once I had that reflection and realized that, she just has a different set of experiences that is telling her what she's doing is right for kids. I have a very different set of experiences. So how can we meet each other somewhere in the middle so that we can both give students what they need? Because we both agreed that there were some gaps in the school. And so once I did that and I was able to power map and really take the onus on myself and understand that it's not everybody else, you also contribute to this, and how are you showing up and how can you do that better, I was able to affect change much more rapidly than I was before. And so this collective leadership piece is very important and interesting to me because there are so many women in education, and if more women were working together and understanding the power that they have, I think change would be happening at a much more rapid speed than it is now. And so I really like to think about how can we teach the importance of building relationships? How can we teach people how to build relationships, especially across lines of difference? And how can we support them in doing that so that we can have more of a collective front and a collective movement in education? I think the thing from the IWL that helped me the most, just in the programming, being in a room with all women where we were able to hash out all of our differences and debate and agree sometimes, really showed me the importance of that. And so one of the things that I've always done with teachers is have mandatory affinity spaces. Now, we had affinity spaces by race, which is different than at the IWL, of course. But in those spaces, we were able to have people of color really push each other and question each other on how is white supremacy culture showing up in your classroom? What can you do to dismantle that? How is anti-blackness showing up in your classroom and in you? And how can we build ways for you to unlearn those things? And in the white space, white people were able to push each other and ask each other those questions so that when we would come back, whole group, everybody was able to see their place in fighting for equity and what they needed to do from their different vantage points. And I loved what you shared earlier about owning your privilege, because we don't need people apologizing for it. That's not going to get us anywhere. But how can you come to this space? How can you come to rural South Carolina, as a white woman from New Jersey, and still understand the many contributions that you can have because of your privilege that someone else from South Carolina might not have? And how can you work together and build a bridge and have that collective leadership to create a more equitable system?
So in my line of work, I've seen really traditional masculinized brands of leadership, and I've seen a more collectivist approach to leadership. And I think in my role on staff now as clinical supervisor and director of the department, I've really come to borrow from each. I think I was really fearful about whether the style of leadership that suited my personality best would serve me in a professional space. I had a lot of anxiety in the IWL, that there were aspects of my personality from which I'd have to dissociate in order to be a good enough leader. I also think that I've come to really accept and perhaps celebrate at times the importance of modeling humility as a leader and imperfection for my staff, and celebrate vulnerability. In fact, it's something I frame for my supervisees as something I can help them best with. A lot of the technique, a lot of the clinical skills, that's what you can really hone from textbook. In this relationship, there's a mentorship, a commitment I have to the relational pieces of what we do, the humanity, bringing the humanity into the work that we do. I think that took a long time and a lot of energy investment to be okay with, and then eventually to really celebrate. I think I appreciated most the range of leadership that was modeled and encouraged in this program. There's leadership potential in disclosing humanity and not always doing things perfectly or with the utmost confidence. I named that, at this level of education, at the doctoral level in psychology, there's a lot of competition and ego investment. And I think that really dismantling that, unlearning some of that personality trait that helped get you there, to help get you to that level of education, to really kind of unlearn some of that to really remain in that profession and have success in that profession. That's something that I really prioritize in my role as mentor or model for what this work can and should look like. There's always something that comes to mind that brings about a lot of shame for me, but something I wanted to really share with you. When I was first licensed as a clinical psychologist in Pennsylvania, I was preparing for my first intern, someone that would come on as my student. And I was working under a boss at the time who would frequently humiliate and dismiss others, namely the women on staff. And I remember dreading this student coming. The idea that she'd witness me tolerating the level of disrespect that had become normalized there. There was such shame I had about her watching this, or allowing this to take place, or doing not as much as I could to contribute to a space that challenged that leadership style, if you want to call it that. Knowing that I'd be responsible for a significant portion of her training helped me hone the seniority that I had on staff to contribute to a healthier dynamic, and one that I could be prouder to have her witness and be a part of. It was an unsafe space for her to really grow and learn, and I took it on as my responsibility to ensure that I was contributing to a space where she would be celebrated and valued and not humiliated in the way that I had come to tolerate.
Thank you all. I think the health field is very hierarchical. Can you hear me? Is this working? Not really. Okay,
Maybe hold it closer.
Okay. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, we found it. I was going to say, I think the health space is very hierarchical. I think people at the top tend to be men. I think more and more women are in the health field. Like most medical school classes are majority women. Most public health schools are majority women. It's like 70% women. And so a lot of the people I work with are women, in contrast to maybe like the legal or corporate space. But I don't often see feminist leadership. I see people modeling the system that they were a part of and working with it, whether it works or not. And so I think, what was I saying? But I think these things are changing too, like in this time, because I was part of a group of fellows that did the Global Health Corps Fellowship. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it recruits people who are interested in global health from many different countries around the world. And my country cohort, who went to Uganda, was half Ugandan and half American. There were no American male fellows. There were 5 Ugandan male fellows in a class of like 30 of us. And to see so many women interested in global leadership and what that really means was such a beautiful thing. And it goes back to this like building of relationships and having seats at the table and stuff like that. And so I was very critical of the models of leadership they used to train us in this program, because I think they also reflected this hierarchical leadership style, which I don't agree with. But the conversations I had with other people about community organizing, engaging people around us, and building relationships, like you all mentioned, I think really resonated with people, and I think it's something that all of us have championed in our own ways. And I've been really inspired by the people that I worked with. For example, my co-fellow, her name is Bonita, and she has a U.S. patent on a sickle cell diagnostic application, and she's a software engineer, and I don't even know why I was paired with her because she's so amazing. But yeah, I think also part of our job is to highlight other leaders and be like, wow, look at this person, she's so cool, like, hire her. And speaking speaking of hiring, I think something I took away from the IWL, which Cheryl Clark, thank you. Cheryl Clark mentioned is negotiating and knowing your value and asking maybe your male colleagues how much money they make. Because in health in particular, like women who work in public health are not paid very well. And I tell this to all my friends, I'm like, negotiate. The least you could do is ask. The worst people are going to say is no. But if you have an offer, it's your right to negotiate something that you want, even if it's like extra vacation time. Or I heard somebody negotiated an extra part of a healthcare package that they wanted to cover, to actually like freeze her eggs so that she could have kids later on. And it's like, that's something you can negotiate in a job, but that's also things that people don't really talk about that much. And also something I learned here that I really appreciated, especially when it comes to job searching, is asking people about work-life balance in their office. Mm-hmm. I think it often gives you a lot of insight into what working at that organization is like, or what that company is like, because they'll be like, well, if you figure out how to work it into your life, then you can do it, maybe, like. And so it usually gives you a lot of insight into how overworked you'll be, if these people care about you having a personal life or not. And I think those things are important for us to hold for ourselves and in thinking about self-care.
Thank you all. I was struck by one thing in particular, which I hope the program has helped with, which is the empowerment that all of you seem to have to ask the right questions. And I think that's such an important empowerment principle, is there's always something that you can do in changing your attitude or changing the situation, even if it may not change the entire situation. So I really took that from all four of you in different ways, and I think it's really important.